Did you have a trip your family took while you were growing up? Maybe to visit relatives across the country, or maybe back to a parent's hometown, or that one resort or beach town you visited every year without fail. You develop a certain routine. You might stop at the same hamburger joint like Melvin's in Elizabethtown on the way to White Lake, North Carolina. You may fill your car with gas at the same Scotchman service station because you know they have the cheapest prices. You get a feel for the landmarks, the DuPont plant, the Smithfield pork processing plant, the bridge across the mighty Cape Fear River, and the bait shop right before you enter the FFA camp at White Lake. If your kids are young, you might pass the time by playing I Spy or singing songs. Our kids still remember that Susan and I would count the cows in the fields on our side of the car riding through the country. The Israelites had similar travel customs and traditions. Israelites wore a groove between their homes and the temple, making the trip several times during their lives, and they would often sing psalms as they made their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Psalm 84 was one they traditionally sang. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. This song might be sung several times along the way, ringing the theme that they were headed to God's courts. With rising joy as they approached the familiar destination, they would reiterate their central story as God's people. Stop for a second and think about this. The Son of God probably sang this song as a kid. Joseph and Mary most likely sang this song as they traveled to the temple to have him dedicated when he was 12. Some of the first sounds he would remember on earth were these hopeful words over and over. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. These were songs of comfort and longing, songs of home. We still sing these songs and similar songs as we tell these stories today, as we are on our own pilgrimage. We are not all the way home yet. We are not fully at rest. We are still on the journey. Jesus journeyed. He knew the fatigue and boredom that would occasionally arise, but he also knew the excitement of traveling with family. And that's the key. We are the family of God, still on that journey. The blessing is that Jesus journeys with us. He walks with us and he sings with us the songs of his home. I'm Greg Williams, speaking of life.
Anyway, today I thought we'll learn a little bit about and be inspired by this wonderful woman in the Bible. Her name is Phoebe. Anyone hear of Phoebe? A little bit about her?
Yeah.
Well,
I think in the New Testament. Huh?
she's in the New Testament. Right. It's working. So, as you can see from the slide, she was a loyal follower of Jesus Christ. But probably more importantly, as far as what's written in the Bible about her, she's an emissary of Paul. Now, what does that mean as an emissary of Paul? You also notice in the slide here that she's holding a cross in one hand and also a scroll or a manuscript in the other hand. So what is this manuscript that she's holding? And that's the key to identifying Phoebe. Paul writes about her in the book of Romans. And let's go to the book of Romans. And she is mentioned in the very last chapter of Romans, chapter 16. Now, the book of Romans is probably one of Paul's more longer epistles to his various churches. The thing about this book of Romans, or at least the church in Rome, Paul did not establish that church. Okay, but he's going to write about it anyway. Phoebe was an early church leader of the Christian movement back in the mid-1st century AD. So we see here, let's just read the first verse in chapter 16, and I'm using the Passion Translation. Paul says, "Now let me introduce to you our dear and beloved sister of the faith, Phoebe, a shining minister of the church in Cenchrea." Why would she need a written introduction in the book of Romans unless she was going to hand deliver the epistle, the manuscript of the book, to Rome, to the Christians in Rome? And that's the reason for why you see these various icons of Phoebe with a scroll or a manuscript in her hand. That is the book of Romans, the very book, 16 chapters in our New Testament. Now, of course, we have the English version, but she had the original manuscript that Paul wrote. Paul really greatly admired and respected Phoebe, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But we read here, Paul is introducing her to the Romans through this letter. And he says she's a sister in the faith, meaning that Paul felt her as an equal. And he expected the Christians in Rome to not only respect her, but treat her as an equal too, as we will see. The Passion Translation mentions she's a minister of the church in Cenchrea, and we'll explain that in a little while. Okay, where is this church in Cenchrea? Okay, can you see, Joe? Want me to move over more? Okay. As you can see from the map there, Cenchrea is in Greece. Cenchrea is like a port, a very busy port, and is actually part of the city of Corinth, only 4 miles away. And she is the leader of that particular church in Cenchrea. Paul mentions her, but he does not mention her husband or anyone else, which indicates that she was probably single or a widow. And she was also, as the Passion Translation mentions, the leader or the minister of the Cenchrea church. So likely she actually owned the house or the building where the Christians met there, which meant that she was probably pretty well off. As you can see, Corinth had probably several house churches, and one of those house churches was Cenchrea. Corinth was a very busy port city, as I mentioned, and in Paul's time it had well over 100,000 people, probably could be a couple 100,000 people, but it was a very busy city. And so they probably had several house churches there. Let's go on to the second verse of Romans 16. And the Passion Translation says, "I am sending her with this letter and ask that you shower her with your hospitality when she arrives." So the Passion Translation is making it clear that she is going to carry this letter to Rome. Most of the translations do not have this phrase, with this letter. It's just kind of assumed. And if Paul was going to send another messenger, or even go himself to carry the letter, then there would be no reason why he would even mention Phoebe, right? So the Passion Translation tries to make that clear, that she was the emissary of Paul, the personal representative of Paul. And he mentioned, shower her with your hospitality when she arrives. You notice the gender. It's a woman. Now, most or traditionally or customarily, the messengers were men, right? But here Paul is sending a woman. Why is he sending Phoebe? Now, we know that back then, the Greek culture, even the Jewish culture, treated women like second-class citizens, right? So this is going to surprise Rome when she gets there, a woman, you know. Paul wrote this letter around AD 56, so about mid-century AD. And he is writing this letter in Corinth and or Cenchrea. You can see the distance here between, let's say, Corinth and Rome. It's almost a straight line of 825 miles. That's a long ways, especially going back 2,000 years ago. And that would be a very arduous trip for anyone, whether you're a woman or a man.
By sea or by land?
Well, I'm just drawing a straight line. If you measure that line, that's 825 miles. So they had to go by road and by sea somehow. And it would take probably at least 3 weeks for 2,000 years ago to get there. So it wasn't an easy trip. Plus, it would be a dangerous trip for a woman. I think the reason why Paul sent Phoebe, because since Paul wrote the letter either in Corinth or Cenchrea, he spent many months there, it's likely that he was a guest of Phoebe in the house church or the building or church that she owned. And since he was a guest there, probably for months while he was writing this letter, I'm sure they had many discussions of not only the gospel, but also what Paul thinks should be in the letter to the Romans. So she was the most qualified, you might say, of anybody to be the emissary of Paul to go to Rome. That brings us to the question, why did he write the letter to the Romans? As I mentioned, he was not the founder of the church. It was established by one or several other people. There's no evidence in the New Testament that any of Jesus Christ's apostles ever been to Rome up to this point. There's no indication that Peter, who is traditionally recognized as the founder of the Roman Catholic Church, was ever there also up to this point. And as I mentioned, the book of Romans was written around 56 AD. Now, Paul's first visit would come around 58 AD, about 2 years. AD 61. That's when he arrives in Rome. And as I mentioned, the book was written around 56 or something like that, several years earlier. And Paul knew he was going to be delayed. That's the reason he wrote it first and was expecting to have someone carry the letter to Rome. When Paul got there, he did not expect how he was going to get there. Okay, what happened was, after he left Cenchrea and Corinth, he went to Jerusalem. And while he was in Jerusalem, he got arrested. And he was put on house arrest that would be around AD 58. And then he doesn't go to Rome, and he went to Rome as a prisoner in AD 61. So it was several years later that he gets there, but not the way he intended. Furthermore, in addition to writing Romans, he wanted to tell them why he didn't want to write to them. And we'll see that verse here. In Romans 15, it says, "It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. This is why I have often been hindered from coming to you." In other words, he didn't really want to write the letter, partly because, number one, he didn't establish the church. Someone else established the church, or some others, could be more than one, established the various house churches in Rome. So he didn't want to be presumptuous and kind of take over, you might say, usurp whomever founded the churches in Rome. And so that was the reason why he hesitated to write to the Christians in Rome, because he didn't want the leaders of the churches there to think that he was trying to take over, by writing this letter. However, Paul really felt compelled to write to the church, even though he didn't start it. We see here in Romans 15, verse 15 and 16, it says, "Because of the grace of God gave me to be a minister of Christ, Jesus to the Gentiles." In other words, he felt he had the commission to go to the Gentiles from Jesus Christ himself. Therefore felt kind of compelled to write to them. "He gave me the priestly duty of proclaiming the gospel of God, so that the Gentiles might become an offering acceptable to God, sanctified by the Holy Spirit." So his primary mission then, let me go back. So his primary mission was, since he did not establish a church, was to make sure they had a written record of the gospel. Up to this point, everything's been oral as far as the teachings in Rome. He had written letters to his other churches that he founded. But since he did not establish a church in Rome, he was afraid that there'll be heretics coming in and giving oral messages, and they would not have a written record of the gospel. So that was the main reason why he wrote the gospel to the Romans. Obviously, he wanted to encourage them too. But he also mentions that one of the main reasons for him to go to Rome, because he wanted to use that as a base camp, you might say, to eventually get to Spain. And he mentions here in Romans 15, verses 23, "So many years I have longed to come and be with you. So on my way to Spain, I hope to visit you as I pass through Rome. And after I have enjoyed fellowship with you for a while, I hope that you would help me financially on my journey." So he was appealing to the Christians in Rome to support him, just like Phoebe supported him in the churches in Corinth and Cenchrea. He was appealing to the Roman Christians to help him as he journeys to Spain. Now, we have no evidence that he ever went to Spain, but that was his intent. And you can see it's a long distance from Rome, let's say, to the east coast of Spain. Again, if you drew a straight line to the east coast of Spain, that was about 860 miles by sea. And if you took the old Roman roads, let's say go north of Rome into France and then come down into Spain, that would be another 1,400 miles. So it was a long trip. So he needed a lot of resources to get to Spain. Money, food, people to come with him and so on. How did he learn about the church in Rome since he didn't establish it? There were many Jewish Christians that he met while he was on his missionary journeys to Macedonia, to Asia Minor, to Greece, and so on. And he mentions about 25 plus names in the last chapter of Romans. And most of those names were Jewish Christians from Rome. So they were kind of scattered. And the reason why they were scattered was because a few years earlier, Emperor Claudius chased them out of Rome, or tried to expel them out of Rome. So they had to leave the city. So that's how he met many of the Jewish Christians from Rome at that time. What's interesting, I found as I kind of went through some of the names, about a third of the women, a third of all those Jewish Christians were women. So it indicates how active they were in the early church movement. Let's go back to Phoebe now. And Paul mentions, embrace her with honor, as is fitting for one who belongs to the Lord and is set apart for him. So provide her with whatever she may need, for she's been a great leader and champion for many. I know, for she's been that for even me. Here, again, Paul is emphasizing once she gets there, treat her with respect, even though she's a woman. And treat her as if Paul, was there personally. So that's what he's encouraging the Roman Christians to do. He also mentions that she's been a great leader and champion. And that's translated from the Greek word prostatis, meaning a leading officer presiding over many, a patroness or a benefactor, which indicates, as I mentioned earlier, that she was probably pretty well off. She was a benefactor to Paul. He says that she's been that for me, which again is another clue that Paul probably stayed as a guest with Phoebe all these many months as he prepared the letter and as she was learning or discussing with him the gospel. Phoebe finally gets to Rome between AD 57 and 60, at least a couple of years before Paul shows up as a prisoner. Now, when she gets there, she, like any of Paul's messengers, she's expected to go into the house church or the synagogue or wherever she had to meet them. And she had to get up there and read the letter for the first time. All in our New Testament, all 16 chapters. And so I'm sure that shocked many of the Roman Christians, of women standing up in their church, speaking up. And that's what she did. And in addition to that, when she's done, the tradition was that anyone in the congregation can ask questions of the speaker if they were a little confused or had some doubts about what he was saying or whatever. So Phoebe had to be prepared for that too. And another reason why I believe Paul stayed with Phoebe to prep her, and she was the most qualified to explain what Paul might have meant in some of the passages in the letter. Now, having said that she was a church leader, she was a messenger of Paul, and she spoke in the congregations in the Roman churches. The questions sometimes come up when you hear messages about Phoebe. Was she really a deacon in the church? No. And as you see in the NIV version, it mentions, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. Okay, that's the NIV version. The King James Version has a different word for deacon and so on. And the Passion Translation is a little bit different. And we see here, I put three different translations here. The NIV says deacon. The Passion Translation says she's a minister. The King James Version says she's a servant. And all three English words comes from the Greek word diakonos or diakonos, meaning one who serves. Okay. Paul calls himself a diakonos, one who serves. He called some of his closest followers, Timothy, Apollos, diakonos. He even referred in Romans 15, verse 8, referred Jesus Christ as a diakonos, meaning a servant to the people. When the book of Romans was written mid-century, most of the churches were pretty small. So there was no real organized structure in the church. There were no official titles, you might say. There was no official office of the bishop, of the elder, of the deacon. That would come later toward the end of the first century. But when in mid-century, there were no such offices as the office of the deacon. So there were no titles. There were elders, basically, and then whomever decided to help out the elder. They were called diakonos, referred to deacons, but it wasn't an official title. So I want to clear that up because I don't know why there's this debate that, well, was she a deacon in the church or was she not? It doesn't matter. She was a true servant of Christ. That's what's important. Yeah. Now, having said that, she was a church leader. She spoke, gave messages, like in Rome. Then we read other verses that Paul wrote in other of his epistles of women keeping silent in the church. Now, is that a contradiction? I mean, was that a tradition, or was it something more than that? So let's go to 1 Timothy, and we'll read that. And I want to mention that there are only two places that Paul writes that women should keep silent in the church. And we'll explain the context behind those verses too. In Timothy, well, let me go to Timothy. In Timothy, Paul is writing to Timothy.
You can see that.
Oh, you can't see it. Okay? In Timothy, Paul is writing a letter to Timothy. Timothy is in Ephesus. Okay. The second letter that Paul writes that mentions about women should be quiet in the church is 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Ephesus, like Corinth, were Greek cities. And in those Greek cities, the pagan Gentile women that eventually converted to Christianity worshipped the goddess Diana, or sometimes called Artemis in Greek. Diana, like the Phoenicians called Diana Esther or Ashtar. Okay, so they're all one of the same. And in those two churches, the women were the priests or the priestess in those churches. Okay, and they were the church leaders of those churches. So that's kind of the background. So let's read 1 Timothy 2 in the NIV, verse 11. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Now, if you read that, it sounds clear. Women, be quiet in the church, right? But you have to look at the context. What caused Paul to write that in Timothy? And again, he's writing to the church in Ephesus, primarily Greek Gentiles that were converted. The baggage that they brought with them was what they did in the temple of Diana. They spoke up, okay? So let's look at the Passion Translation. That will give us a better context. It says here, let the women who are new converts, okay, that's not in the NIV. Let the women who are new converts be willing to learn with all submission to their leaders and not to speak out of turn. I don't advocate that the newly converted women be the teachers in the church, assuming authority over the men, but to live in peace. For God formed Adam first, then Eve. So the women that Paul was really talking about are the new Gentile women that were converted. And as I mentioned, they carried the old baggage into the Christian church. They were used to speaking up. Okay, and Paul is saying that you're too immature to speak up. You don't know enough. So, out of respect for the speaker, you should just kind of hold your tongue for a while. And you notice my footnote H there, and I want to read, and this is from the Passion Translation. It puts it into context there. It says, in the context of the day, it referred to women arguing with their male congregational leaders. In the pagan temple worship of Diana, the goddess of the Ephesian people, it was most common to have a female leadership. For the women who converted to Christ, their only cultural context of worship was that the women were the leaders. In the Christian church, however, it was the men who were commonly made up the leadership of the congregation. Paul telling the women, be willing to learn, means he was instructing them to take a respectful posture of the disciple in the new way of worshiping the true God. So the Passion Translation has chosen to make clear what was implicitly understood by the early Christians in Ephesus, making it explicit for those of us today from another culture and another era. So, yeah, Joe.
I'm just sitting here thinking about all this, and I'd like to just interject a thought about the fact that in general, women were not educated. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Phoebe was. She was able to read what Paul was supposed to expound upon. Mm-hmm. And which ties in with this kind of new extended information. Mm-hmm. These these Gentile pagan converts, they would have been used to talking, yes,
Yes.
but not necessarily, again, educated, and certainly were not educated
In the gospel,
in the
yeah,
gospel.
yeah.
And so that was all new. They had to all learn that.
They had to learn that.
Women had to be quiet.
Right.
But unfortunately, down through the ages, mostly from the Catholic Church, they've used this to apply to all ages and all cultures. And it would
And
not
all
certainly
circumstances
apply
too,
to
right?
our society of the last 100 years, maybe, let's say, when women have been allowed to,
Right,
to be
right.
more educated
Right.
and learn it.
Yeah.
So, but it's too bad that this was not brought out in, let's say, our King James Version.
Yeah,
Back
yeah.
when all these men were,
Right.
some of the, like,
Mhm.
not just the Jews, but a lot of the other denominations were very strict about
Right.
women.
Women, right.
Look at the Amish, they had to separate the men from the women.
Right.
And,
And that's the baggage of their culture too. It's kind of a cultural thing too.
It's too bad we all couldn't read Greek or
Yeah.
whatever, so that we could have gotten a little more
Yeah.
knowledge like this.
Yeah.
And
Let's go on to Corinthians, because that was another Greek city that had a similar problem. So Paul had to address that particular issue as well. So 1 Corinthians 14, again, I'm going to read the NIV version, and the context here is about prophesying in the church and speaking in tongues. That's the context. Paul says here, "For you can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged." In this case, all means everyone, meaning whether you're a man or a woman. If you have the gift of prophecy, you could speak up, but in an orderly manner. Don't interrupt the first person that may be speaking. And we know that there were Christian women in the early church that had the gift of prophecy or were able to prophesy from time to time. Anna is a perfect example. That's the NIV version. Let's see. Let's continue. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husband at home. For it is disgraceful for women to speak in the church. What I am writing to you is the Lord's command. Again, the context is prophecy and speaking in tongues. Let's look at the Passion Translation and see what that says. The women should be respectfully silent during the evaluation of prophecy in the meeting. In other words, if they had a question, don't interrupt. Let the person finish. They are not allowed to interrupt, but are to be in a support role, as in fact the law teaches. If they want to inquire about something, let them ask their husbands when they get home, for a woman embarrasses herself when she constantly interrupts the church meeting. So again, the baggage that they carried over when they were pagans, worshiping Diana, for example. They were used to getting up and speaking and, I guess, interrupting the speaker from time to time in the temple of Diana. So you notice the footnote B. I'll read the footnote B and from the Passion Translation, and that would kind of help you to better understand what he meant. The theme Paul is addressing is unity and mutual edification, not simply the role of women. Women are permitted to speak in church, to prophesy, and to minister the gospel, This is the Passion Translation footnote. Paul is apparently prohibiting interrupting the leaders as they evaluate prophetic utterances. It is likely that Paul was addressing a specific issue taking place in the church fellowship of Corinth, with women interrupting the meetings with their opinions and questions about the prophetic words just spoken. Possibly even words spoken by their husbands. Oops. Let me go back here. So, it's not a gag order, a total prohibition of women speaking in the church. It was a restriction on them in terms of interruption, okay, as a person was either prophesying or even speaking in tongues, which is, as we know, speaking in tongues, just speaking in a different foreign language. Basically, he was saying in the early Christian church, everyone should be orderly and everyone should be respectful. That's basically what he's saying. So finally, about Phoebe's legacy here. Paul, I'm sure it wasn't his intention to memorialize Phoebe. I mean, the reason why she was in there was to introduce her as his emissary. But it was certainly God's purpose to put this in the Bible as an inspiration for everyone else who's going to read the book of Romans. So we see here that Paul certainly respected her as a mutual leader. It didn't matter whether she was a woman or a man. We also find out, and we know, that she had a very close relationship with God, demonstrated by her not only devotion, her humbleness, and her being a diakos, meaning her service. And the ministry of Christian women is certainly vital and important, even if it's not in the leadership role. So let me conclude by saying that Christ expects all of us to be a diaconess, like Phoebe. And I think that was the reason why he put her in the book of Romans, to inspire us as well. Amen? Yeah.